In this tutorial, I'm going to give you an introduction to working with the basic panel in the Develop module in Lightroom. Now, if you're new to Lightroom, I recommend that you check out the workflow tutorials I have in Lightroom for organizing and setting up a Lightroom catalog, and also how to import your images from either a memory card or a hard drive using Lightroom, and also setting up your catalog. I think this is really important that you're across all of this so you've got an understanding and you're not losing files, and you've got a good file naming protocol set up. It's going to save you lots of heartache down the track. So check those out first if you haven't already, and then come back and have a look at this one. All right, so you've got your image up, imported into Lightroom, and your catalog's all set up, and your image is on the screen. The panel that does most of the work, and I do most of my work in Lightroom, is in the Develop module. That's it there, and it's the basic panel, so it's the first one there. And this, I would say, 80% of the editing work in Lightroom is done in this panel. Now, before I get into the retouching, I just want to give you a quick overview of Lightroom and a couple of the things that you may or may not be aware of. So what you've got is there's three panels. So down the left-hand side, you've got your navigator, your presets, and a history panel. Now, when you've got your image on the screen, if you've imported the presets from the download section of the website, you'll have the navigated window there, which is the image that you've got on your screen. And if you just hover over the presets, you'll get a little preview of what the preset is going to look like. So here I've got the awesome preset selected, and if I just hover over each one, you'll see in the navigator window a preview of how that's going to look. So that's a really quick way, without altering your image, to see if there's anything in there that might look good on your image. So they're really good to have a play with, and it might be, this is probably how I developed my style, which I started with the presets that were already loaded into Lightroom, and I played around with them and just found new styles that I quite liked. So that's just a good thing to do with the navigator, and you can quickly, at a glance, see what all the presets do. Scrolling down further, you've got the history panel, and what that is basically is, as you're making adjustments to your image, the history panel will record everything that you do. So you can see in this image, I can go back and I can undo everything that I've done to that image, all the way down to where I opened it up at the start. And so if you make a mistake and don't like the last thing that you did, you can just go back to the previous state. Now, if you want to undo something and use a shortcut, let's just convert this to black and white so we can make it something obvious that's changed. And say you don't like that, Command Z, and you'll go back. And if I want to go back another state, Command Z or Command Z will take it back, and you can see that I can just keep undoing all the settings, and you can see that it's going back down in the history panel. So and it's Control Z on a Windows, and that will undo in step by step by step. All right, so that's a really handy shortcut. And also, let me just go back to black and white so we can see something obvious. If you hit the backslash button, that'll give you a before and after. So just hold that down, and there's before and there's after. And that's just using the backslash button. One that I like to use is a compare mode. So if you hit Y on the keyboard, that'll give you a before and after image. And so you can just compare where you were from the start and all the adjustments, and that's a good way to have an overview of what you've done, all the adjustments that you've done to your image. And if you hit Y again, it'll get back to that state, or just use the backslash for before and after. Now, if you want to quickly navigate around your image or zoom in and out, you can just place your cursor anywhere over the image and just click, and that will zoom in, and just click again and it'll zoom back out. Or you can use again the Z or Z key, and that will zoom in and back again using that. So the idea is to have maybe one hand on your mouse working the sliders, and the other hand will zoom in and out for you. You can also change the default settings here. So at the moment I've got it to go back to fill the screen, and I've got the zoom set at 2:1. But if I wanted to, I could make it even bigger. So I could set it at, let's say 8:1. So now when I click in, you can see, if I click in, it'll go all the way up to the face, or I can choose anywhere where I put my cursor. So let's say that I want to zoom in on this back area here. It'll zoom in on that, or on his hand. Okay, and that's really handy to know. And you can also use the navigator. So you can see that little box there, and I can now pick the areas that I want to zoom in on. So they're just a couple of little handy ways that you can navigate around your image. All right, so let's have a look at what all the sliders do in the basic module, in the basic panel in the develop module. So before we start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset my image. So to do that, there's a little button down here on the right hand side of the screen. It's got reset on it. If I click on that, it'll bring my image back to the settings that I imported it with. Now, if you've got just a couple of points here with the sliders, so here are all the sliders in the develop module. Let me just move a few around. If, let's just say you've got an image set up and you've moved all the sliders, and you want to reset one of the sliders or a couple of the sliders, you can sit there and you can do it by hand, which can be really frustrating. The quick way to reset is to just double click on the slider itself and it'll go back to 0, or you can double click on the actual slider part of it and it'll also go back to 0. So either double click on the word or double click on the actual slider button, and that'll reset it to 0. And if you want to reset the entire image, then you can hit the reset button. If you want to make more precise adjustments, so let's just say you wanted to adjust the exposure and you're having trouble, like you wanted to do like plus 1.6, and which is so frustrating to do. You can see that. What you can do is just double click on the box and the number will be highlighted there, and then you can increase by using your arrow key. So I'm using the up arrow key, or you can come back down and use the down arrow key, and that's just a really precise and way less frustrating way to adjust the sliders. Or you can highlight the number and enter the figure that you want to adjust, which like 50 is clearly overkill, but that just gives you an idea. I mean, I much prefer using the up down slider keys. All right, so that's just navigating your way around and using those sliders. So I'm just going to reset that. All right, so everything's set to 0. Let's go through what all these sliders do. Now, the first two are to do with white balance and color temperature. Now, white balance, there are a number of super detailed tutorials on white balance. So if you're not sure about how to set white balance and what it is, I recommend you go and have a look at those tutorials, and that will explain everything. And so that's what these first two sliders basically cover: the color temperature of your image. Now, if you're not dealing with adjusting the white balance, you can actually warm up or cool down the image using the temperature slider, and the tint slider. You can add green or magenta to those as well. So that if you want to do some funky adjustments. But I think as a beginner, these are best left as shot. If your white balance is widely out, then I highly recommend that you check out those tutorials and learn how to set the white balance correctly. So just quickly, for this image, I always look for a neutral point, and I'll do a click balance and make sure that I've got the right white balance. And so now Lightroom has adjusted that for me. So that's the first step that I will do. All right, so before I get onto the sliders, I just want to point out that there is an auto setting in Lightroom, which can be a good way to sort of get into using Lightroom and have an idea of what you need to do. It's just like when you picked up your camera for the first time, you would have used the auto mode, and then as you got more confident, you started using manual mode or aperture priority to get your head around how the camera works. All right, and so Lightroom is the same. There is an auto setting, and just like shooting on auto with your camera, using the auto settings in software like Lightroom, it also has its limitations. Sometimes it gets it right, but the edit that it's going to give you is going to be fairly conservative and kind of very generic. And so in order to develop a style, just like with the way that you shoot, the aperture that you shoot with, the shutter speed that you choose, the focal length, every decision that you make is going to put your own style or mark onto that shot. And the same goes for how you're going to edit the shot. So the way you choose, say, a warmer color temperature over a cooler color temperature is going to have a massive impact on how that image is viewed. And so too is the way that you edit the image. Now, the way I like to edit my images is very dark and moody and often a bit grungy. I don't do that for all my images, but definitely for my personal projects. And then there are other considerations that I might need for clients as to like what kind of image are they requesting. Do I need to get more detail into the whites? Is it a fashion shoot where it's important that the garment is shown and I'm seeing the most detail, or do I need the sky in the background? So on this image here, so you've got the auto button here, and basically if you click on that, Lightroom will look at the image and it's got its own little mathematical algorithm that it'll use, and what it's done is, in this instance, it's increased the exposure, it's dropped the contrast, dropped the highlights a little bit, up the shadows, added some white, added some black, no clarity, no vibrance. So we can see before and after, or I can put it up Y to show you the before and after. So if I just hit auto, that's how Lightroom would have edited my image. Now, if this was up to me, I probably would have gone a lot moodier. I would have wanted to rescue the sky a lot more, added some more black, and I like clarity, so I would have boosted the clarity a little bit more and maybe knock the saturation back, up the vibrance. So something like that. So you can see the difference with doing it your own way and putting your own mark on the image, or just going with auto. But auto is a really good way to start. But also what I want to show you is Lightroom doesn't always get it right when you do the auto settings. So have a look at this image. This is a raw file straight out of camera, and if I zoom in, you can see the water droplets there. The image itself, I believe it's a little bit blown out. I think there is a lot more detail in that flower than you can actually see. Now, if I am to go with, and just click on auto with Lightroom, that's what it's done. So basically it's dropped the exposure by 10. It's added a little bit of contrast. It's dropped the highlights a little bit. It's added a little bit of shadow, a little bit of white, a little bit of black, left all the others alone. So have a look at the image. So that's the before and after, and you can see that it's picked up a little bit more detail, but I know there is a lot more detail. So if I was to reset that, I'll show you how I would edit this image. So just by dropping that highlight slider all the way across, have a look at how much more detail I've picked up in that flower. And I can also maybe just add some shadow. I would add some black, so holding down the option key, sliding that across, and because it's nature, I'm going to give it a bit of clarity, and I'm also going to just brighten the image up overall. So let's just go back to, just knock that black back. So huge difference from what Lightroom gave me as an auto setting to taking control of the camera, taking control of the software yourself, and knowing what you can do and how you can improve that image. So that's another reason to understand what all the sliders do and take control of your own editing. Let's have a look at the sliders here in the basic panel. So the first one is exposure, and so basically you move the slider to the right, it's going to adjust the exposure of your highlights, your midtones, and your shadows equally. All right, so it's increasing the exposure, and if you go across to the left, it'll decrease the exposure in the highlights, shadows, and midtones. I believe that this slider is a little bit aggressive because it does everything all at once, and I try and avoid using this slider altogether, or really conservatively. It's usually the last slider that I will adjust. So because I find it's too aggressive and you're adjusting everything across the board, and like say for if I've got an image that's underexposed, let's have a look at this one. So I've lost detail in the shadows. If I increase the exposure of this image till I get a good looking skin tone, it's going to be at the expense of the detail in the shirt. My background is blown out, as is the hair. There is a better way to save that detail in the skin tone. So I tend to leave that exposure slider alone. And the same goes for the contrast slider. So the contrast, if you move to the right, it's going to increase the contrast of the overall image. So midtones, shadows, and highlights. Again, I find it too aggressive and it does everything at once. And if you drop the contrast, move the slider to the left, it will decrease the overall contrast of your image. So again, this is these two sliders I tend to leave till the very end if I need to. So skip these two as a starting point. The ones that I absolutely love working with, and I think are the most powerful sliders that Lightroom has, is the highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. And the reason I love the highlights and the shadows in particular is you can individually target these areas. So if you want to adjust an image, you can rescue highlights, or you can bring out shadow details. So let me show you what I can show you with the highlights on this image. So I've got this image here, and I've exposed nicely for the skin tone because I've used fill flash. There's detail in his shirt, there's detail everywhere in the background, but the sky is looking a little bit blown out. So the first thing I do is I can drop the highlights to the left and have a look at how much detail I can bring back into that image just by dropping the highlight slider down. So that's one thing that I love to use if I've got an image that needs more detail, and it's fantastic for bringing in details in the sky. Let me just reset that image so I can show you. So you can see this image here, shot in RAW. I know there's lots of detail there in the sky, and just by dropping that slider down, I can pick up a ton more detail in the highlights of that image. All right, the next slider I want to show you is the shadow slider, and I think this is the magic slider, and I think people avoid using it, but you can be super aggressive with this slider and really pull out a lot of detail in the shadows, and it's magic, and it's like adding fill light to your image. So I've got this image. The highlights are all well exposed at the expense of the shadows. So I don't have a lot of detail in the shadows, but if I bring up my shadow slider, have a look at this, it's like magic. Suddenly I've brought back all that beautiful detail in the skin tone. And what's fantastic about just using the shadow slider rather than doing it with the exposure, look, have a look at exposure, lifts everything. Highlights, shadows, midtones are all lifted, and so you lose detail. But if I just select the shadow slider, it's only targeting the shadows, and I've managed to save all the detail everywhere else. So that's why I love working with that slider. The next one is the whites and the blacks. Now, whereas the highlights, if I lift the highlights, it'll find the brighter parts of the image, all the bright parts of the image, and lift those. So everywhere that's light will get lighter. All right, and it'll leave the darker areas alone. The whites are more selective, and it'll only increase the whitest, brightest parts of the image. So if I do the whites, you can see that it's targeting the whitest, brightest part of the image. So it's a little bit more selective in that regard. And the same for the blacks. If I decrease the blacks, you can see that it's the blackest areas get blacker. And if I go the other way, it'll reduce the blacks in the image. So these two sliders are important because what you want in an image is you want to have a really good tonal range. And so what I like to do to finish off an image is I like to add a tiny amount of white. And the way I do that is I hold down the white slider and I hold down the Option key on a Mac or Alt on a Windows, click on the slider and slide across to the right until I get like a white speck there on my mat. And that's showing me that I've got just a little dook of white. So you can see that little red area there, about there. And that now I have a good white point on my image, and I do the same to get a good black point on my image. So it's just making sure that I've got a really nice tonal range in my image, and it's kind of a way of controlling the contrast in the image. So holding down the Option on a Mac, Alt on a Windows, click across to the left, and I'm just adding, and usually with the blacks I add a little bit more black so you can see the outline of where the black is, the black pixels are being affected. And so just kind of about there looks about right. And so now I've got an image that has a good white point and a good black point, and you can see before and after. Okay, and that looks pretty good to me. So that's the whites and the blacks and the shadows and the highlights. The next slider is the clarity slider, and what the clarity slider is it adds contrast, but only to the midtones. So this adds like a bit of punch and a bit of crispness to your image, but you've got to be super careful with the clarity slider, because if you go too far, it adds a halo to your image. So let me just show you on a colored image here. If I just slide that all the way across to the 100, you're going to see that you'll get this sort of halo effect. So the midtones have all been increased in contrast, but you start to get that halo effect. And I'll show you on another image here. So let's just say that I increase my shadows and I bring up like nice detail there in the rock. Have a look what happens when I increase the clarity. Can you see that little halo that's happening there? And you also get this sort of cartoony effect. So you've got to be super careful and a bit conservative with the clarity. It does look good, but it can be a bit cartoony if you go too far. So try and be conservative with that, but it does add some nice punch there in the midtones. All right, so the last two sliders are Vibrance and Saturation, and both of them increase the saturation of the colors, but they do it in a slightly different way. And the best way I can show you is, let me just bring up this image. Okay, so let's do saturation first. So I've got an image, I've got greens and blues and yellows, and then there's a good skin tone in there. So if I was just to increase the saturation, what Lightroom does is it increases the saturation of the colors across the board. So you can see that all the yellows and greens are getting brighter, but so is her skin tone, and it just doesn't look very good. So if you've got an image where the colors are muted and you just want to give them like a pop, so you've maybe shot on a day that it was a bit overcast and the light was flat and the colors are looking a bit dull, and you want to boost the saturation, using the saturation slider will boost the saturation, but it's going to come at a cost of your skin tones and a lot of the other areas, because it boosts all the colors. So, I can show you on a landscape as well. Let me just get this. All right, so if I've got that, if I boost the saturation, you can see that the yellows pop, the sand gets brighter, the rock gets brighter, every single part of it gets brighter, the sky, and it just is overcooked. Okay, but if we do that, the same thing with Vibrance, which again boosts the saturation of the colors, but what it does is it'll take all the muted colors in your image, the duller colors, and it'll bring those up, but it protects the skin tones. So it's a really good way that if you want to give your images a boost, go with Vibrance rather than saturation. So have a look at this. If I increase the Vibrance, you can see that it's not really affecting the skin tone until I go all the way, but it'll bring some saturation into the blue shirt and also into the green, but it's not heavy-handed like the saturation is. So Vibrance is, if you want to give your colors a boost, a bit more pop, always use the vibrance and pretty much ignore the saturation because it's a bit heavy-handed. So like here's another image where we've got flowers in the shot. I can boost the saturation, see what happens to his skin tone. The colors pop, but the skin tone looks terrible. But I can do the same with the vibrance, and I can bring more saturation to the colors, but his skin tones are protected. So they're all the basic sliders. So let me just show you a few real world examples of that. So I've got this image here clearly underexposed, but so what I would do for this is I would, in this instance, drop the exposure a little bit just to bring in some detail into the water. And then the next thing is I drop the highlights to bring in some detail in the highlights. Give it a little bit of shadow. Add some white. Add some black. Add some clarity. And sometimes I like to drop the saturation because I don't like the sort of the orangey glow, the digital glow that some images get. And so let's have a look. So we've got before and after. So that's just a basic edit there. This one was one that I wanted to show you. So here we've got a street scene. And again, what I would do is open up the shadows, bring in a little bit of detail, see if I can rescue the highlights in the pavement, which I have. Make sure I've got a good black and a good white point. So holding down the Option key on a Mac or Alt on a Windows and just bringing in a good white point. All right, and a little bit of clarity. Okay, so once I've got something that looks fairly okay, I can see that I still probably need to increase the exposure a little bit on that image. Okay, and so that's just a basic edit using the sliders rather than going to, let me just reset that. I could have just gone with the aggressive all using the exposure slider, but you can see that I lose detail in the concrete, and there is a better way to do it just by using those individual sliders. So shadows, highlights to bring in detail there, then bring in a little bit of exposure and make sure there's a good black and a good white. And then you can come back and tweak the exposure a little bit there to get the right look in the image. Also some creative uses for the sliders. So I've got this image, let me just reset it. All right, so I've got this image here that was taken where I exposed deliberately for the highlights in the image. So I'll show you if I bring the exposure up, you can see what the actual street scene looked like. But out of camera, it was shot like this. I exposed for the highlights. So now if I wanted to make this a moody black and white image, I can play with the sliders and I can increase my highlights. So I want to actually make this area brighter where the sun was, increase my highlights. And then if I want to decrease the detail in the shadows, I can go the opposite direction with my shadows. So I'm crunching my shadows and I can add black again. So this is a way of adding contrast, but I'm doing it selectively. All right, and then I can add a little bit of white. And so now I've got a very contrasty image and I can convert that to black and white, and I've got like a low key street shot. And then if I wanted to, like at the end, I could even play with the contrast slider more. So I've got a high contrast shot there in black and white, and that's a way to work with the sliders in the opposite way. So once you know what everything does, it's really easy to manipulate images, and that's just working in one basic module. So I've got another image here. Let me just reset it. Okay, so here's a street scene. And what I can do is I can either play with my contrast, I can reduce the contrast to bring more detail into that image, okay? And then I can open up my shadows and I can reduce the highlights, and all of these things, what they're doing is they're reducing the contrast. So there's less contrast in the image that brings in more detail. Put a little bit of black there, add some white and some clarity, and finally some exposure. And what I've done is I've flattened the whole image out. I can now go the opposite way, so I'll reset that image. And let's just say I wanted to make this a really moody black and white shot. So what I can do is, instead of opening up the shadows, I can go the other way and crunch the shadows, and I can add more black. So you can see what's happening. I'm really increasing the contrast here, and now you can see you're getting an image that's it's just isolating this woman here, and it's all about the heavy shadow. And this is something that you see done a lot in street photography. And I can also just increase my highlights, which are the brightest areas of the image. And so now it suddenly becomes a much more graphic image, where it's just about the woman. She's isolated. She's definitely now the hero of the shot, and we've gotten rid of all the detail that we don't need, and the eye is drawn to the most important part of the image, this woman walking through this little shaft of light. And I can kind of now just tweak the exposure a little bit and convert that to black and white. Once it's converted to black and white, that's when I'll play with the contrast slider as well, and then just tweak back, maybe add some white, add some more black. All right, so that covers the basic panel in the Develop module in Lightroom.